Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on Polyvagal Theory.
What is this about?
Yeah, I'm going to begin by explaining the theory since probably most of our listeners aren't familiar with it. So, it is a theory that concerns the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that's responsible for all our involuntary actions like breathing, and which we've talked about before, and our heart rate and our gut. So one of the most important nerves that is involved in these functions is called the vagus nerve, and it's one of the longest and most important nerves in our body that is physically connected to the heart and lungs and gut, as well as the brain, of course. And what triggered this theory to be conceptualized was a paradox that the vagus nerve is related to a high heart rate variability, which can be used as an index of stress, vulnerability, but the vagus nerve also regulates the extreme slowing of the heartbeat. And so the question is, how can it mediate both? And so neuroscientist Stephen Porges came up with the polyvagal theory that the vagus nerve, which sends its output into the several regions of the body, can be divided into different categories that have opposing functions.
Okay, what are these different categories and opposing functions?
So this is where it gets interesting. So first, there is a system called the immobilization system. This is the vagus nerve that is unmyelinated, which means it is not covered in a fatty layer, which means that because there isn't this fatty insulation of the nerve fibers, signals pass through them more slowly than myelinated fibers. But anyways, this system is found throughout different species, from humans, all mammals, and all vertebrates, which includes reptiles and amphibians. And it is thought to be the most primitive of the systems that underlies responses to danger, terror, and stress. So activation of this part of the vagal system, which is referred to as the dorsal vagal complex. Activation of the dorsal vagal complex results in things such as decreasing muscle tone, reducing cardiac output to reserve metabolic resources, and
So
also
slowing down the heart rate.
Yes, exactly. And also anything to reduce metabolic demands, which is basically necessary for survival in any extreme threats.
Yes. So I was just wondering, is the dorsal vagal complex specific to an area in the body or the brain?
Yeah, so it's called the dorsal vagal complex because it originates in the dorsal part of the brainstem, which is at the base of the brain, but it also innervates, so it sends its outputs to below the diaphragm.
Okay.
That's why it's able to alter more things related to visceral organs like the gut. Whereas another system is then the ventral vagal complex, which in contrast to the dorsal, it's myelinated, and it is also evolutionarily newer. So it is specific to mammals, and it innervates parts of the body above the diaphragm, including the face.
Oh, okay.
And the interesting thing about this system is it promotes pro-social behavior. And
What is pro-social behavior?
so, like, our facial expressions that can promote us being sociable, like smiling.
Okay. So like recognizing someone else's smile
No, so
or
it's
like facial expression?
the creation of our own facial expressions.
Okay.
Which can be in response to
Yeah.
others' facial expressions, because their facial expressions are going to be controlled by their
That's so interesting. How like
ventral vagus.
why is it that like a happy face results in a smile as opposed to like a frown? You know, like
Oh,
the
yeah.
feeling of happiness.
That's really interesting because it's not the same in all animals.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know too much about that topic,
Me neither.
but
I also know that there's these mirror neurons, which basically like
yes, they mirror what you see
yeah,
in your own behavior
and in other behavior and other people's behavior, so then you react like that.
yeah
Yeah. I don't know enough about mirror neurons to
Me
talk about it
neither.
right now, but yeah, I just thought
Perhaps in a future episode.
yes.
Yeah, but this is what's really interesting, that the autonomic nervous system was historically always thought of as just like being responsible for things we can't control. And so it was always very much studied under this light of like just kind of
Lack of volition on our part.
definitely lack of volition, and also therefore not having like a huge role in things such as social behavior. Also, I need to do another disclaimer that this is a theory, and there are criticisms of the theory that it's not anatomically precisely correct, but the general ideas are there, and this is what we'll be discussing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and another interesting thing is this evolutionary shift in the what the autonomic nervous system is capable of, and how it's sort of like adapted this new function
Of pro-social behaviors.
exactly. And bidirectional coupling between our bodily state and our social behavior, because like the vagus therefore is able to control both what's happening with our heart rate and our breathing and our digestion, as well as our social behavior.
Oh wow, that's
Yeah.
so interesting.
Yeah. There's a third system in polyvagal theory, which is the sympathetic nervous system. So, I probably should have also mentioned the vagus nerve is thought of as being part of the parasympathetic nervous system,
Okay.
which is responsible for what they call rest and digest. The opposite of that is the sympathetic nervous system, and it works in tangent with the parasympathetic nervous system. That is responsible for what they call fight or flight.
Okay.
So together, the sympathetic nervous system, the dorsal vagus, and the ventral vagus make up the polyvagal system, and they balance out one another. And at any one moment in time, depending on the environment, one particular system can become more predominant and override the others. Like how I talked about during threat, the dorsal vagal complex would therefore take over and respond with these primitive autonomic functions. But when we're in a safe environment that we perceive as safe, the ventral vagal complex would
Be more dominant.
would be more dominant and promote pro-social behavior.
Nice. That's so interesting.
Yeah. I want to highlight here what I found really interesting is that how safe we feel, or our perception of how safe we are, determines how pro-social we are.
I was thinking that. Yeah, it's so interesting. So perhaps someone who's in a bit more of a stressful or anxious state may be acting less pro-socially.
Yeah.
And
which I feel like I can relate
yes,
with.
And
yeah,
maybe we are quick to judge, but perhaps the dorsal vagus nerve is just being dominant over the ventral one.
Yeah.
And they don't. Yeah.
Yes, and especially with anxiety, that would activate the sympathetic nervous system. So yes, actually it makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so how can we put this theory into practice? Well, this is where I mention why I got introduced to this concept to start with, and why I'm interested in it is my love for yoga, which I practice yoga
and teach
sometimes.
Very good teacher.
And Carolina is one of my yoga students. So, yeah, but this theory interlaces with the benefits of yoga practices really, really well, and it interestingly really links with the philosophy of yoga. So yoga has a very complex and rich philosophical background, and I'm definitely not going to go into all of the details about this, but it's interesting that the concepts of polyvagal theory mirror with key concepts in yoga philosophy. So yoga philosophy is primarily dualistic.
We're laughing because we have another episode on materialism and dualism.
Yes.
If you listen to it.
And you may find my views are even more confusing now that I'm here saying that I'm a yogi. Um, but okay, so in yoga philosophy, suffering is thought to arise from a misalignment between the material world and the spirit, that is pure consciousness. So the material world, or material nature in itself, is made up of three main components, and these are what mirror the three polyvagal systems.
Oh.
So in yoga philosophy, these are called the gunas, and one is tamas, which is inertia, delusion, and indifference.
Oh, wow.
So this is thought to be to correspond with the dorsal vagal, because it is the immobilization system. In moments of complete terror, the first thing we do is not to react, but to become immobile, which is what the dorsal system does.
Okay.
And this relates to tamas, the concept of inertia.
Okay.
And then we have rajas, which is energy, turbulence, and pain, and chaos. And of course, this relates to the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight. And then finally, you have sattva, which is joy and calm, tranquility and light and pleasure, harmony. And this relates to the ventral system, which supports social behavior, connection, and what Stephen Porges refers to as eudaimonia, which is my new favorite word because it means human flourishing.
I love that.
Yeah.
I've heard another definition of eudaimonia, which is well-being in the experience of pain, illness, or disability.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I like the concept of human flourishing more, but
I do. That does sound much nicer.
But they're basically synonymous.
Yes.
Yeah. And so these three, sattva, rajas, tamas, and also again the dorsal system, ventral system, sympathetic system, are in flux and always in a constant balance with each other. And it is thought that an imbalance can lead to suffering and the opposite of eudaimonia.
Yes.
So what's really interesting about this is then that in yoga, you're able to observe the flux of these gunas, the three systems, and this can first of all promote sattva because you have more top-down control of the ventral vagus system, which makes it more accessible, and this promotes sattvic behavior or emotions. And secondly, you become less responsive to alterations in the gunas and to alterations in your environment, which enables us to essentially dissociate from them and realize how separate we are from the material world.
Yeah.
I'm saying this again thinking about our materialism episode where I basically argued for a more materialist perspective.
Yeah.
But yet, I do, this still makes sense to me.
I mean, I think it's fine and healthy to categorize philosophical theories with personal yoga philosophy, as well as scientific beliefs and theories and rigor. I think you can't really judge one field with the properties of the other.
Yeah.
So I think it's perfectly fine to have different opinions on materialism in philosophy and in yoga philosophy.
Yeah. In a way, they combine and make sense in my own head. But perhaps one day I'll be able to actually express it through words, why it makes sense.
I find that so interesting about yoga theory, and in terms of the sattva and how it relates to top-down control. I read this interesting paper by Sullivan et al. 2018. So she essentially says that yoga-based practices focus on the integration of bottom-up neurophysiology as well as top-down neurocognitive mechanisms. And I think it's interesting how I think you mentioned that the top-down is usually associated with sattva and the bottom-up associated with is it rajas or tamas?
I think you're right. So yeah, top-down is more associated with sattva than both of the others.
Okay, so my question is, Aren't we assuming that the top down mechanism is a really positive and
I see
sattva
where you're
like
going with this.
because and then I understand that with yoga it really helps you focus on interoception and being more at balance with the external environment versus your internal, and perhaps tuning down a little bit the bottom up inputs from the environment. But I wonder, when we do this, what it results in terms of interoception, and yeah, if we're making an assumption of what the top down mechanisms may be.
So I see what you mean, as in if the top down control is negative, like if you're having negative thoughts, then how is this gonna help you be more sattvic? Well, firstly, I think the key point is top down control enables increased stability. So this is like similar to what we discussed in the breathing episode of practicing breathing and our conscious control over it, which then in this case practicing consciously controlling our thoughts and our state of anxiety would help you to maintain this state in the face of changing environments.
Yeah.
So I think a top-down control that would be negative, like perpetuatingly bad thoughts or stressing yourself out, wouldn't actually activate the ventral system. It would activate the sympathetic system. So I think top-down control can occur for all of them, but specifically top-down control that is implemented by yoga practices are promoting the sattvic ventral system.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
but obviously, if you constantly practice the opposite of like promoting your negative thoughts, then it's gonna probably increase your rajas and tamas and your dorsal system and sympathetic tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think from what I understand, the key point is to be able to have more control of the bottom-up inputs and the external environment, which I think overall introduce a general sense of stability, which I guess helps and contributes to the sattva state.
Exactly. And I just want to mention that something I find really interesting when you were saying about having more control of our environments, as in controlling our response to the environment. It just reminded me of when we discussed evolution, and we're discussing how humans may have in a way more control of our own evolution because of this new ability to have top-down control. And of course, like yoga, I'm gonna assume is human specific. Even though all the poses are named after animals, you don't really see the animals doing the yoga. But the fact that this theory incorporates evolution into this new the ventral system that evolved in humans, and this being related to the human-specific practice of yoga, and I don't know, it just all fits together so well, I think. And it is so interesting, this concept of like top-down control, like offering us a new way to interact with our environments and sort of be separate from it.
And I guess just be in charge of our own responses and our own stability and peace of mind.
It kind of makes me uncomfortable, actually.
Really?
I don't want to have too much control.
I mean, I don't think we have that much control in the first place. I think you need to do a lot of yoga and meditation in order to get to that point.
But do I want that control? I don't
feel like we're very much at the mercy of the external environment most of the time because of our lack of control.
Yes, that's true.
Our responses and our inability to control most of our responses just speak to how vulnerable we are depending on the environment we're in.
Yeah.
And if we have a bit more control over that vulnerability, I think that's a good thing.
If it's used in a positive way, which again yoga does promote.
I don't do as much yoga as you do, but I do really enjoy meditation, and
well, I would argue that meditation definitely is a bigger part of yoga than what people normally think of yoga as being a physical practice.
Speaking of evolution and the control we may have over our evolution, I don't know if you looked into whether the bidirectional coupling of our physiology as well as the pro-social behaviors, if it happens in a specific point in evolution, and if that's why it's very specific to humans and perhaps mammals as opposed to other species.
I'm not sure what point in evolution it occurred.
I wasn't quizzing you on your taxonomy. I don't think you knew exactly, but I was, yeah.
I mean, I read about it in terms of human thing. At this point, it would just be me speculating, but I suppose like animals that are sociable through their facial expressions should should neurophysiologically be similar in this. But yeah, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so unfortunately I don't know.
What about like body languages and cues? A lot of most animals express themselves through bodily cues and sounds and vocal noises, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And
is that different from pro-social behavior? Like, is it a very specific thing to our facial expressions?
Again, I'm not entirely sure, but the thing about the facial expressions is that according to the theory, the neural pathways are physically linked to like the muscles of our face, so that it can control our facial expression. But
if we have any evolutionary biologists listening, do let us know.
Oh, yeah, please teach me about it all. Anyways, we'll wrap up the episode there. So I hope you enjoyed learning today about polyvagal theory
and yoga
philosophy a little bit, and how science is beginning to reconceptualize very historical concepts that yogis thought of thousands of years ago.
Do check out the website, because we put all the links for our readings that we did for the podcast episodes if you're interested in reading more about yoga philosophy.